Hi, everyone. We're starting our webinar recording. We're going to wait a moment or two for some attendees to come into the room, and we'll start in just a couple of minutes. In the meantime, Rocco, do you want to talk about AC Milan and who they're playing
I do. I just received the potential lineup against for their Champions League, and I would have played Origi instead of Giroud. That's my first comment of the day, but I am strangely confident. And everybody was saying that Origi was going to be a terrible signing, but I think he's going to be a good signing.
All right, and Uli, I think you decided to not use the Bayern background for today.
He's not allowed. They're playing tomorrow. If this webinar
correct, it's not our day today, exactly. So I'll leave it over to Rob for the moment.
All right, fair enough. And Lori, go Astros, I guess.
I know that was hard for you to get out, Mike.
It really was. I've given up on baseball this season. Well, to everyone who's joining, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen to our about to start webinar. For those of you who don't know, I am Mike Carlo. I am proudly on the HEDNA board of directors, and I run a company called XanderPay, which many of you have heard of. I'd like to welcome our panelists and every one of our participants to the webinar. I really would like to thank Adyen as our payment sponsor for 2022 and their sponsorship of HEDNA and these webinars. Important things to plan ahead for. We will likely have one more webinar later this year, or possibly during the first week or two of January, in preparation for the HEDNA Seattle conference, which is the week of October, January 30th. For those of you who've been in the past, I expect that we're going to ratchet up the content a bit. For those of you who haven't been before, we're looking for a very intensive payment track or fintech track, as we're calling it. We've started to put together the agenda, and it looks pretty amazing. The concept for today is we're going to talk about continue our discussion that started during the pandemic about a contactless customer journey. And we've seen significant changes in mindset of both travelers and hoteliers in the course of the last 3 years. I think, between worries about COVID and the inability to hire qualified staff to work at hotels, there's been a lot of tumult in the industry. And one of the most challenging has been the check-in process and the checkout process. And I think as we've talked through this at HEDNA Paris and in subsequent conversations, one of the big questions that comes up is, why do we do things the way we do? And who really enjoys waiting in a long line to check into a hotel just because somebody needs to scan your credit card or look at your passport? So that sort of has led to a furtherance of the discussion about the contactless customer journey. So today we pulled together a very interesting, I'm going to go with unique, each in their own way panel. We are joined by Lori Gablehouse at Worldline, Rocco Pizzarello from Sabre, and Uli Pilau from Apaleo. I'm going to ask each of the three of you to introduce yourselves, and then we'll get going with some hopefully provocative, if probably not controversial, questions. So, Lori, would you like to go first, please?
Sure. So, Lori Gablehouse, I'm the head of travel solutions at Worldline. Background mostly with airlines, as you can see in the background. Also, in the last 10 years, been working closely with HEDNA and the payments working group, and helping to, I hope, redefine the infrastructure and the processes for hoteliers around the payment journey. And very excited to be here today to talk about the latest trends and what we see moving forward.
Thanks. And Rocco?
Yes, I'm Rocco Pizzarello, AC Milan fan. For those of you who just didn't pick that one up, but the days like this, we always have to wave the banner, as they say. I work at Sabre. I've been in payments most of my life. I've worked for FDC, some of the acquiring banks, and at Sabre, I mostly work on the airline side. So I'm with Lori. Lori, we work together. And I'm here to, as Lori, I think she stated it brilliantly, to basically talk about latest trends because they apply to both air and hotel, and the challenges apply to both air and hotel. So I think that would be, hopefully we get a great discussion going.
Thank you very much. Uli, please.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I'm Uli Piller, one of the co-founders of Abaleo here in Munich, Germany. I'm originally a hotelier, but switched sides to hotel technology many years ago, and then have been part subsequently of building up some of the bigger tech companies in the hospitality space, Fidelio, Ideas, a couple of others. So mainly on a hotel tech side, PMS, platforms, revenue management, and so on.
That's great. So we have a diverse background, and we can apply different aspects of the customer journey. For those who are watching live, if you wish to ask a question of the panelists, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. For those of you who are not watching live, you can ask questions, but it's probably not going to get answered. So with that, the first question for us that I'd like for us to discuss is, can we really imagine a hotel world without a front desk for check-in and check-out?
Well, if we can imagine the Jetsons, where you have a flying, billboard with a flying policeman behind it, I think we can. The question is going to be the timing, right? Because you want to have a completely, I don't want to call it person free because that's wrong. In some cases, you want it, right? If it's a luxury hotel and things like that. But how do we get the infrastructure in place, and how do we get old processes to be new, right? That's going to be the toughest part, because a lot of people say we have to keep this because it works, that kind of thing.
Well, but if we look at that, Uli, as a hotelier in the past, I mean, I think part of the challenge is the hotels know a way of doing something, and do you think that the notion of not checking in at a front desk is acceptable to large parts of the industry?
I think it's becoming acceptable on a much wider basis right now. If you would have asked me 10 years ago, most probably I would have responded differently. But today, when we look around, especially here in Europe, we see in the different countries lots of accounts popping up that actually do staffless hotels. One of the biggest ones I know is over 100 properties now, and they only have staff at the headquarters. However, I think, as you say, it's not a fit for everybody. So 5-star deluxe hotels would still want to have a reception with personalized services. But I think it depends a lot on the technical background. Is it possible or not? It depends a lot on the concept of the accommodation provider. Is this something he had in mind from the beginning and wanted to go for? And then obviously it depends on setting the right procedures from the first touch point of the guest to leaving the hotel. And this is something a lot of people have not embraced yet. But as I said, we see it popping up more and more over here in Europe.
Yeah, so I mean that's actually spot on, because I was just at a supermarket, right? And the supermarket was going through a big change, and they just rolled out self checkout. And I think it is exactly what Uli just said, is that you have to have the technology, the process in place. And by the way, you'll still have to have somebody there, because when you can't figure out, like in my case, I was buying wine and somebody had to tell them I'm old. They should be able to know that right away just by looking at me. But that's that kind of process is so I think we need to look at other industries which are going there, right? And then see how that would apply to hospitality and airlines as well, right? Airports, you're seeing it again with it used to be a guy with a stamp with your passport. Now you go and even in places like in Italy, it has updated with touch and clear and things like that. So I think looking at other industries will be interesting.
Yeah, it's funny. I have global entry in the US, and now at LAX, I don't even need to give my passport. It's just a retinal scan and keep walking, which is amazing. Lori, back to the question of a world without a front desk. From a traveler, is there, I mean, as a frequent traveler, do you see what sort of benefits do you see about, well, I can flippantly say getting to a hotel and seeing 12 people in front of you, but is there anything in particular that you would ask of a front desk agent upon check-in that couldn't be automated?
Well, I think in different regions of the world, you find different challenges and hurdles. I can say that, in most cases where I have my data stored with a particular brand, that the process can be very frictionless. I can pre-check, I can get my room in advance, get my room key in some cases to my phone. But in other parts of the world, they haven't quite reached that point. And I think some of that goes back to the Rocco trying to buy wine, because it's the ID validation step that, they still want to take a copy of my passport, and God knows where they're putting that piece of paper. I don't know.
Exactly. So I think that the theme for this Mike, will be for the next HEDNA conference, me trying to buy wine. So I will walk into a grocery store and then try to buy wine. But no, I think that that's.
But I do think that's a very good example of, you can do so much. I mean, infrastructure, Yuli can help you understand as well. There are lots of legacy systems that get you from the point of purchase of the booking to the property. And the question is, when prior to arrival at the property, how much of the desk can you clear? How much of the little things that in the past you always required somebody to physically interact with you to check those boxes or get those documents validated or whatever it was, how much of that can you now actually pre-do? And I think, again, in many ways, many regions have sorted that out on some level with their digital transformation of their phone, mobile device check-in. They've managed to get to a certain level of, okay, you're frictionless up to a certain point, and then you have to stop for something. But
I think
one interesting point here, I think, is when you look at the most successful accommodation providers that are doing it here over in Europe, so in UK, France, Spain, Germany, and some other countries, a lot of these guys have been starting from scratch, so there was no legacy at all in place. And a lot of the founders are actually coming from different industries or different verticals. They are not coming from the hospitality industry anymore. So they attack things differently because they just don't look at the legacy and the existing procedures within the hospitality industry. They start with a white piece of paper and say, there's no reason why we can't do it at 100% digitally. And funny enough, these guys always arrive to kind of realize this at some point and be able to make it happen.
It's a great
expand on the I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Mike, but I want to expand on what Lori said about trust, because I think that's going to be a big one, right? You said that you can go to LAX and just retinal scan and go, but you can't go any other airport because nobody trusts you there, for good reasons, obviously, right? but I think the idea of a global trusted authenticator, that one is going to be, I think, as big a challenge as technology, right? Because I think you could probably do it in the US, Canada, Europe, but after that, it gets to, the different kind of trust. So it always comes back to me buying wine, obviously. But I think I'd like everybody to comment on how do we still don't do it at airlines, right? Because there's no global entry that's truly global. It's when you're coming in to the US and you've set up the trust with the US.
Well, I think there's a slight difference between hotels and air. There's the reason for ID check is mostly security, but also some fraud. In the hotel sector, given that you're not just going through a 2-hour flight to get somewhere, you have to stay somewhere for a long period of time. We don't have the same levels or types of fraud in the hotel industry. And one of the things that I've been discussing with folks is, well, why do European hotels require a copy of a passport. And everyone says, oh, it's a government regulation. Well, why do the governments require that? As far as, people who are much more knowledgeable with the situation than I have shared, is it's something that's gone on back to, the war in 70 years ago, as a way of just knowing who was where. And I think one of the questions is, what are we trying to accomplish with that whole poor front desk person having to make a copy of a passport? Is there a valid business reason, or is it an archaic government rule? And I think you sort of take a different approach to solving that based on what the answer to that question is.
But in most of the European countries, actually, it's not a must anymore. I think the procedures have been going away over the past couple of years. And I think Corona over the past 2 years actually accelerated what was happening, because in a variety of countries over here in Europe, actually governments have now allowed to do digital registration and digital identification of passports and things like that. Although it's not legal everywhere or legally approved, still the people accept that there are different ways now of looking at passports and taking passports and entering registration information. So I think it has been going much faster over the past 2 years than it has been going over the past 10 or 15 years here in Europe.
That's very interesting. So let's set aside the need for a front desk to collect IDs and realizing that there are probably automated electronic ways to do that. If we look at the payments flow with a virtual check-in, there are 3 companies I'd like to mention as being interesting for the hotel industry to learn from. The first, of course, is Uber. You set up an account, you never have to worry about a payment ever again, unless you buy too much wine at the grocery store and you don't have an available balance. The second is McDonald's, which has largely replaced its in-store register staff with very simple to use, even I can use kiosks, and Expedia, which is much more akin to the hotel industry and has managed to create a significant payment hub for travelers around the world. So as we look at virtual check-ins in the hotel sector, I'll start with you, Lori. How would hospitality payments, compare and contrast to those 3 companies potentially?
Well, I think, Uber wins the award for frictionless on payments. They started it. I think they provided us with a way of interacting that took the payment friction out of the journey. It just was a journey. You just get in, you get out, you're there, you're done. And it's very transparent. And to the point about trust, payment generally is a trusted link of events, and how you link the consumer, the person buying, to who is actually taking that money. But, is that a B2C or is that B2B? And I think in the OTA world, to your point about Expedia, they had to create an ecosystem, a payment ecosystem that says, how do I collect money from a consumer and then pay my suppliers? And I think this is where hospitality is a bit different from airlines, right? There's just a lot more on the B2B side than in the airline industry. We can go back, I don't know, ARC and IATA, BSP could probably go back 40 years for how you move money from a third party like an Expedia to the supplier like an airline. They've had an infrastructure for that forever. That never existed in the hotel world. And in lieu of that, the hoteliers had to move through and create different ways of contracting and managing that process of, well, you took the money for the room, but now how do you get that to the hotel property? And I will, to Uli's point, I think COVID really accelerated everybody's interest in how does that process really work? Because refunds became a thing, right? Things weren't open all of a sudden, and I wanted my money back, but who was it coming from? And that, I think, does move the dial on how much of your business is direct and how much is it through a third party. And are you now, from a payments perspective, considering a strategy moving forward that starts to move some of that business back to your direct side, where you can control the experience, where you can close the loop a little bit and make that process work differently and behave differently?
Or do you need to also, or I guess it's not an or, and you also need to better integrate with your third party?
Yeah, figure that out.
To make sure that the data flow for check-in is a bit more seamless.
Well, the data follows and to our point at HEDNA, in our working group, we created the HTNG spec that we published during COVID that gives you some framework from a technical perspective for how you can flag how that money is going to be done. How are you moving that money? Are you moving it through a virtual card? Are you actually, it would be nice if we could move to other types of payment methods that are less expensive from an acceptance perspective, and certainly have different fraud and chargeback implications. So I think the hoteliers have figured out they need a payment strategy, and it needs to kind of align better with their distribution strategy.
And when we look at the markets over here in hospitality industry, actually the pressure has been increasing even more this year. And there are two main drivers, I think, for this. One main driver is that actually the cost pressure for hotels and hotel groups has been going up tremendously because of inflation, increasing personal cost, and a lot of other things, which actually put a lot of pressure on the hoteliers to become more efficient and more automated. That's one driver. And the second driver over here we see in most of the countries is that there is a clear shortage of staff now for the hotel industry. Alone in Germany, we have seen 800,000 people moving out of the hotel industry during Corona. And this is happening in many countries. So there is just not enough staff available to put into a hotel at the front desk anymore, at least trained staff. And so that requires now changing procedures at the hotel level. And obviously, without having a good payment flow before the arrival or even during the stay at the hotel, it's not possible to automate those procedures in a good way.
So, how do we, or do we need to define the benefit to the guests of these streamlined payment services? Or is it something that the guests really want that the infrastructure and legacies prevented?
I think it's more up to the hoteliers to better understand how well a good digital guest journey serves their customers. I think the customers themselves, they start realizing how big those benefits are of a seamless payment, included in a seamless guest journey, because that's one of the key things. If you only provide pieces of that, but not automate the full guest journey, then there is always a point where you still have to go to the front desk, regardless whether it's to pay or to check in or to get your room key. So I think the best guest experience results from 100% digital guest journey, including the payments.
Interesting. Rocco, so, as your role as Sabre payment guru, how do airline payments operate differently? And the whole concept of the kiosk and what McDonald's has done, I mean, how applicable is that from the airline industry to the hotel?
Well, payments and wine guru, actually, it's both that I work on. No, I think airlines have an easier process on payments, right? It's not as a disjointed process. You can book directly, and airlines, like hotels, want to collect money to do other things, right? Like seat upgrades and all that. So kiosks are fundamental to them, and that is something that every airline is trying to roll out now. We're back to what was said before about the trust. It's tough to roll it out globally, right? Because you're going to have to support cross-border payments, and if you got a kiosk in this region, how do you support it? But I do believe that airlines have recognized the ability both on a website, a kiosk, or even a mobile concierge, right? Which requires a person, but is somebody with an iPad that walks around and helps. And it is personless, if you will. But yeah, airlines are taking advantage of that. They still have the same infrastructure issues that you have, right? In a common use platform, how does that all work? And that now hotels don't have that because they own the property.
Is there some sort of guidance within the airline industry as to what percentage of check-ins have moved to kiosk or mobile phone? I would imagine it's a pretty high percentage.
Yeah, so you stumped me with that question because it is fairly
Yeah, we
high.
didn't prepare this at all. Sorry.
No, we didn't prepare this at all. I was drinking wine, but it is fairly high, right? And they encourage it, right, through a mobile app and things like, because you just don't want to have huge lines. Nevertheless, if you go to an airport, you still see huge lines, right? Because perhaps baggage check-in is more challenging. You want to make sure you don't lose the bag and things like that. So, there's always something, as they say. But yes, if it's clean and there's not too many potholes in the booking process, like business travelers would have carry-on, yeah, they encourage that, right? They want to make sure that you don't have a bunch of people standing in line.
And it seems
now when you look, Mike, when you look at hotel operations, I think there's something additional there, which is just the mentality of people. Most of the hotel groups that have put kiosks, they've put them somewhere next or close or behind the front desk, somewhere in the hall, in the lobby normally. But they always have the front desk as an alternative. And usually people, unless they are very long queues, people tend to go to a human being to do a check-in still today, rather than to go to a kiosk. So the most successful hotel groups, new hotel groups coming onto the market, that have been using kiosks are the ones that have centered all of their check-in operations and front desk operations around the kiosk, and not around a traditional front desk. So, for example, Citizen M, which are worldwide today, they are really a tech-based hotel group, and they've put kiosks in all of their lobbies and don't have a front desk at all anymore. So you have no choice than going to the kiosk and check in there. But they have ambassadors around the kiosk that really help the people and assist them, but give them also recommendations on the city, on the restaurants, whatever is around the hotels. And they are really successful, having established this concept around the world in all of their properties.
Yeah, it's interesting. Once you check in the first time, it's simple. It's always that anxiety about the first time, checking through a room. So Uli, a question for you. If you look at it from your company's perspective, in the perspective of a PMS, what needs to change? And do you feel like, in general, the PMS providers are anticipating the future, or just sort of keeping the status quo overall?
I would say overall, when you look at PMSs around the world, you have something like 750 PMSs. So it's a very frequented market. And even the ones that are more common around the world, most of it is still legacy today. There are very few native cloud products in the PMS market. And the ones that do have cloud products, they actually are mostly all-in-one PMSs. So they try to push their own solutions. And that makes it really hard for hotel groups and hotels to customize their digital guest journey in any way they want, because they are being forced into some kind of tech stack without being able to customize the guest experience in any way they want. So what I think needs to be changing is there need to be more open platforms and open software pieces that actually allow different flows of how to book, how to check in, how to get your room key, how to pay, all kinds of pieces which need to fit together very nicely. And this is only possible if you as a hotel group can determine which are the apps and which are the components I want to use for the digital guest journey, rather than to rely on the PMS vendor to force you into some kind of guest journey, which is not really a fit for everybody.
Is it the kind of thing where in a year from now, we're going to be, discussing developing joint HEDNA HDNG standards for this concept, or do you think that the innovation is already underway?
I think the innovation to some extent is already on its way. When you look at some of the more modern platforms or software components out there, they allow exactly doing that. I think one of the keys is that the underlying platform needs to allow for any app that connects and serves as a customer touchpoint to use the same payment flow. And this is hard to achieve, but there's some good innovation where you could say, any app that is connected to that platform can actually exactly use the same payment flow as any other app. And that makes it really easy because in this case, the customer digital experience is the same regardless where they pay and when they pay.
Very understandable. It's really just an interesting concept to contemplate, and it sounds so logical to anyone who's walked up to a line of 200 people waiting to check into an airport hotel after a flight has been canceled. So I think there are so many opportunities for the industry. But one of the biggest challenges seems to be misconceptions about the contactless payment journey. Like, Lori, what are some of the myths or misconceptions that kind of need to be busted for our discussed new world vision to be enabled?
Well, I think it's critical to number one, ensure that there is some interaction between the brand and the properties. I think from a hotelier perspective, there used to be this approach that says, well, everything has to be managed by the property, and doing things prior to arrival or prior to check-in or during, pre-check-in, I think is the direction that COVID has helped. I also think the PSD2 and 3DV2 standards and compliance in Europe really moved that dial quite a bit on figuring out how do I take payment prior to arrival, just so that you can authenticate, you can get it all out of the way. It's all done. What's left is really your on-property experience. What do you need to do once you get there? How do you pay for the spa? But it's this idea that everything waited until you arrived at the property. I think we're over that on some level in most areas of the world. It's really driving the entire experience across different owners of that process to ensure that as a guest, I don't need to know. I don't need to know what happened here. I just know that I agreed to something, I paid for that something, and if that something isn't going to be available to me, somebody's got a good way to give me my money back. That honestly is kind of the minimum that everybody needs to sort out. And if you can do that, then you're not only your guest experience from a hotelier perspective, but from a payment perspective is all seamless. And that is, I think, where the digital world has helped everybody quite a bit. But I do think you have to balance and provide choice and transparency along the way. Not everybody's going to use a kiosk. But
Yep.
on some level, you can pretty much agree that they're going to use their phone. So that's certainly there. And really hurdles and concepts around, I think we get buried in the weeds around currency and payment choices on some level, but start just clearing the path and the runway a bit so that from start to finish, at some point you understand how your guest is working through those processes.
Absolutely. Rocco, you had something to add?
Yeah, I was about to say that I think we can almost not talk about kiosks anymore, right? Because it's really the phone now, and how that interacts is going to be the key to move forward. A kiosk, I think, was kind of a bridge for airports, right? Because it could work with a common use. It looked airporty, that kind of thing. But I think it needs to kind of, we need to talk about the fact that likely you may not even see kiosks at airport, right? And things like that.
Well, I might disagree with the hotels.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think the real estate aspect of self-service, in terms of a large item in your lobby or at your front desk, I think that also has gone away with all of this, right? It's really the simplicity of a tablet or, a roaming concierge type of approach, that a lot of that has a lot more applicability in this industry.
Exactly. And then you want to have, if you have physical presence there, it's more for guest experience, towels, wine, if you will. Back to that theme again. That's where I think it needs to focus on things like having a large front desk just to check you in, to check this. Now it even has a plexiglass window sometimes, and it's not very friendly looking. So it's I think it just makes all the sense in the world.
I do think one of the,
I would, Mike, I would even go a step further. I would say actually the expectations of the hotel guests, the travelers, have been increasing tremendously for everything which is contactless, actually. So it's not only anymore about paying your room or your package up front and then arrive at the hotel and get an invoice when you check out. It is also about the ongoing kind of charging of things to your rooms, because what happens if you arrive at the hotel and you have all prepaid, it's all fine, you get your invoice, but still you're not able to charge any drink from the bar to your hotel room without then going again to the reception and pay at the reception what you have just consumed in a bar or restaurant. So I think the expectation of the travelers we see over here is that they can do exactly the same thing on their mobiles while they stay at the properties or before they arrive at properties. So book additional services, drinks, meals, whatever, and then pay them on the mobile. It is kind of tokenized as usual, and yet then you get a new invoice which actually has added as well the charges as well as the payment to your invoice. And I think this is becoming more and more standard with the new accommodation providers over here.
yeah, I think that's everything you guys have said. I agree with. There's one complexity. Hotels don't tend to have the same brand loyalty that an airline has. And so I think, as we move forward with this concept, I may be very comfortable with the Marriott app, but I have not downloaded the Four Seasons app. And there will be different processes. And so I do think for hotels, there might actually still need to be either an iPad or a kiosk type environment in hotel, or maybe there are solutions out in the market that allow for that to be more of a standard process.
I would know today about 5 very good web-based apps. So as a consumer, I don't have to download any app anymore at all. And those apps would actually, without being native, they would be able to cover both payments as well as room keys in a very advanced and secure way.
Thank you. So there we go. We've solved my concern. So what should the industry be doing now? What should we be doing over the next couple of years from your perspective, Willie?
I think the people need to look at what is really my concept and what's my business model. If I'm a 5-star property or a 5-star chain, I will certainly try to stick to the front desk and provide professional services. Everybody else, kind of the budget to 4-star properties, will have to ask themselves, can I survive with having lots of manual procedures in place, or what are the procedures I can automate? And that concerns back office as well as front office procedures. So I think everybody who's on the market already with a hotel or hotel group needs to ask themselves, what can I change in order to become more efficient and automated and to respond to the requirements of the digital traveler? That is one. And then everybody who's coming new to the market, they should actually start with a different concept and from the beginning design their hotel and business model around the digital customer and digital guest journey.
Thank you. Same question for you, Rocco, and then Lori.
Well, I mean, look, I think he couldn't have stated it any better, right? I mean, it's one of these things that when you have a certain perfection, you do not add an extra brushstroke. But yeah, it comes down to the business model, right? I'll add one caveat that I still think back end processes are going to gum up the works, right? Because but even with airlines, how you move this EMD and things like that, it has slowed down the automation process. So back end support from revenue reconciliation and things like that is going to have to be a huge part of this as well, not just the front end process.
Good point, Lori.
Yeah, I think, over the years, we've discussed many different things, but the key moving forward in my mind is always the stakeholders in the process, and how well have you aligned internally on not only your technology and the infrastructure behind what you're doing, not just the front end technology, but to Rocco's point, the back end matters quite a bit as well. And when you're trying to find the money, but how are you aligning just that whole ecosystem with your distribution team? Because they're trying to drive revenue. The treasury team's trying to find the money.
Keep it and make sure they're not leaking any money. Right.
Right. And I think, again, there are three stakeholders always in my mind. It's the distribution trying to drive the revenue. It's the technology trying to deliver the infrastructure to move your marketing strategy through the door. And then the treasury group who's just trying to account for it all. And if you can both at a brand level or at a micro level, at least align those people in terms of what are you doing over the next 3 years? What are you trying to accomplish? And then make sure that the decisions you're making about your PMS, about your contracts with third parties, make sure those things start to align with that strategy. And then you'll move in the right direction. And to Uli's point, it is all going digital. So trying to back away a little bit from hardware and devices and this conception that maybe everything has to happen at the property. No, it doesn't. The property just needs their money. So how are you getting the money to their door? Not just the guest, but the money that goes with it. So that would be my moving forward mantra. I think we used to say fax free.
Mm-hmm.
Are we still saying that? Or are we over it?
I think we're over that because, there's an opportunity to be fax free. Are we going to go desk free?
I don't know. To Yuli's point, I think that's a business model decision.
I think we need to right size the front desk. How's that?
No, I like the right size. This is very good.
So last question for today. If you consider your company's role in the ecosystem and consider your competitors in that part of the ecosystem, do you feel like your competitive group is moving us forward, or are we really just how aggressively innovative do you feel like your segment is being? And Rocco, we'll start with you on that question. From a technology company standpoint,
look, I will say the travel industry in general is not Uber. All right. I think it's moving forward, perhaps slightly slower. They see it in another place and they adapt to it. I think that would be the best way I can describe it. And I'm not just saying airlines and everything. I think it's one of those things that like a grocery store even and things like that is they look at it, they see how it works, and then they say to themselves, this really would benefit us. And that's why I think it could take a little longer.
It's interesting because back in the 80s and 90s, and maybe even before then, it was the airlines that were driving business technology innovation.
Well, the first credit card, right, was an airline, right? BIN 001. Yep. And I just think Lori's point of there's multiple groups now, a sales team that wants to make money, revenue reconciliation team that needs to find and keep the money, and somebody make sure everything adds up, of multiple distribution channel, direct and indirect. To be fair to both hotels, airlines, and everybody else, it is challenging, right? And to make a huge switch like this, you will have people resistant. There'll be people that say, no, we have to have people there because people come to an airport, they want a face-to-face conversation. And there will be old grandpas like me that have that, that they're sticking to that. But I think as new generations don't. That's the way it is.
Well, and the taxi industry and its responses to Uber are very similar to what you're describing.
Exactly, yes.
Uli, your thoughts on your competitive set?
I think the industry has started to move with new technologies coming onto the market, but it's far too slow compared to what would need to happen. And I think one of the reasons is clearly that most of the technologies that are being used by hotels, in particular PMS technology, have been designed and developed some 10, 20, 30 years ago, even when the requirements just didn't exist. So I think there have been some efforts by more modern native cloud PMSs and other systems to drive it forward, but it's by far not enough. So I think there needs to be more modern technology now, open technology, and people need to embrace using those technologies in a much easier and quicker and faster way than those systems that have been around for such a long time.
Yeah, I think that's true. And Lori, with your response to the same question, how difficult is it for payment companies that have invested billions of dollars in POS device technology to address this change? Because I would imagine even within your company, the notion of not having a point of sale device at every 7 of them at every front desk would be sort of daunting.
Well, I think in the payment world, several things. We're becoming a very cashless society. Right? Who travels with a lot of cash in their pocket anymore? Nobody. So what devices do you need to accept payment from your guests? Is that really hardware anymore? Not in many cases. I think we hang on to it out of tradition, out of what we believe is the best way to prevent fraud is card present, to dip or swipe or tap, whatever your choice of the moment is. But moving beyond that, I do think requires some more innovation, because there is still that, from a business perspective, that idea that is my security blanket at the moment, and I'd like to hang on to my safety net. But innovation says even plastic at some point will go as well. And I think that's really the last thing we're hanging on to. We got over the cash. We've moved on. Everybody's moved on beyond that. So how do you now kind of take plastic out of the mix and move more towards that QR wallet approach that actually Uber started, right? They were the card on file guys that started the whole frictionless thing. And that honestly is where we're still struggling on some level in the travel industry to manage that globally, from a currency perspective, different wallets in different countries to support different consumers. So we still have some challenges there. But I think from a payment perspective, we are embracing the idea and the concept that hardware isn't as required as just the idea of how are you actually moving that money from the consumer's wallet to your bank account.
Yeah,
and now one of the things which kicks in there is clearly the next generation and their requirements. I think when you look at our kids, which are 20, 25, maybe a little bit older, they have started to travel all over the world, both on business as well as privately. And they are just used to having a different payment experience with whatever software they use, with whatever system they use. So they won't be staying at hotels anymore where they have to go to the front desk and use a credit card to pay. They are today looking already for hotel groups and hotels where they can get rid of all of that and have the same payment experience as in any other thing they do.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point and a great way to end our discussion today. Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Uli. Thank you, Rocco. Again, thank you to Adyen for being our payment sponsor. And we look forward to seeing all of you in Seattle in a couple of months, last week in January. So thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful day wherever you are in the world.
Enjoy.
Bye,
Thank
guys.
you.
Bye, everybody.